I now give the floor to the representative of Russia Federation.
Thank you, Madam President. We are grateful to Geir Pedersen for his briefing. We carefully listened to Mr. Bernard Duhem. On the anniversary of the Syrian crisis, two questions arise. What enabled this horrific conflict to last so long? And what are we able to do to ensure it ends swiftly? The outbreak in March 2011 of unrest in Syria was tapped into by external forces to stir up the situation in the country. Their aim was to overthrow the legitimate Syrian authorities and reshape the country in their own mold. The country swiftly plunged into chaos, and in most of the country, illegal armed formations took hold. These included international groups which terrorized the local population, creating an atmosphere of extremism and intolerance. And basically, they carried out terrible crimes against civilians. Despite this unprecedented terrorist onslaught, the Syrian state stood firm. With the decisive support of Russia, the legitimate Syrian authorities managed to rout ISIL and defeat other hotbeds of terrorism in their country. In the liberated areas, work has started to rebuild the social and economic infrastructure that was destroyed. As part of effective and measured actions of the Astana format, Russia, Turkey, and Iran have jointly achieved a sustainable cessation of hostilities in most of the country. There are still flare-ups of tension in the Idlib de-escalation area, where a group recognized by the UN Security Council as a terrorist organization, namely Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, has taken hold. Today, in the country, basically the ceasefire is holding. And if the supplying of fighters and separatists were to end, along with attempts to exonerate them, then the whole of Syria would now be free from extremists. From our side, we are convinced that the Syrian conflict cannot be resolved with military means. It can only be settled by fostering a lasting political process based on the Security Council Resolution 2254 with the assistance of the UN. In line with the decisions of the Congress of Syrian National Dialogue in Sochi, the Syrian Constitutional Committee got up and running. Its work is progressing with difficulty. However, it's important to wholeheartedly support and encourage this process. However, we believe that intra-Syrian talks are solely a domestic matter for Syrians themselves, which should not be subject to artificially imposed timetables or external pressure. We are prepared to continue to provide support to the SG's Special Envoy, Mr. Pedersen, in establishing constructive relations between the Syrian parties. I would like to say that more than ever, Syrian authorities need the support of the international community. In his latest statement, the Secretary General stated that today 60% of Syria's population is facing the threat of hunger. People need collective international assistance. However, simply distributing food is not going to solve the problem. There's a need to help ordinary Syrians to rebuild their normal lives by carrying out infrastructure projects for early recovery. We're convinced that this approach will make it easier for Syrian refugees and IDPs to return home. Surveys have indeed shown that most of them still cherish the hope of returning to Syria. Despite all the obvious hardships of the Syrian people, the political opponents of Damascus decided to beat the country into submission. After the failure of the attempt to overthrow the undesirable government by force, they started to exert financial and economic pressure. Recently, Syria has been pummeled by sanctions, which have curbed normal life in the country. Ordinary Syrians de facto are subject to collective punishment. Moreover, the Western countries' humanitarian exemptions to the sanctions regime in reality don't work. This will lead to a further deterioration of the socio-economic situation in the country. And this situation, incidentally, is strongly criticized by UN humanitarian workers who work on the ground in Syria. The situation in Syria would significantly improve if it were to return to the Arab family, and in particular the League of Arab States. We welcome the willingness of Damascus and the Arab states to make progress in this area. And we would call for this burgeoning normalization of relations between Damascus and the Arab world to be left well alone. We view a key precondition in the peace settlement to be the cessation of foreign occupation and military activities which have not been approved by the legitimate government of the country. Another precondition is the respect for the sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity and unity of Syria as stipulated in Resolution 2254. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation.